Hello everyone and welcome to the National Army Museum for this week's Friday Insight. Here at the museum, it is the home of the history and heritage of the Army, a place where you can experience the story of the Army from the perspective of those who served in it. There are many ways you can support the museum: by booking our shop, visit the cafe, donate, or become a member, where you get exclusive discounts and your very own events programme. Today, I am delighted to welcome Professor Philip Shaw. Philip is a Professor of Romantic Studies in the Department of English at the University of Leicester, specialising in British Romantic literature, literature theory, and visual culture. He has published widely on the topics of poetry and romantic imagination of conflict in culture. Today, Philip will explore the world of Victorian military art, reflecting on the relationship between wartime experiences and domestic daily life. There will be time for questions at the end of our discussion for both our online and in-person audiences. For online audience, post a question in the Q&A chat bar. These will be put to the speaker at the end of the talk. Moving on to some technical points. Should we encounter any technical issues, please bear with us whilst we work to rectify them. We find refreshing your browser solves most issues. A member of our team will always be active in the chat. With all that said, I'll now pass over to Philip. I hope you all enjoyed the talk. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you to all of you for coming today. I'm going to start with asking you a question. Have you seen the Myth and Reality exhibition upstairs? Yes. Okay. So some of the paintings that I'm going to talk about today, you can see in that exhibition. Anyway, without further ado, let's begin. Whoops, that's in the wrong order. Yeah, it's a nice picture, but it's gone in the wrong order. Let's get back to the beginning. There we go. Right. So, you'll all recognize this picture, I'm sure. When thinking of images of war in the Victorian period, we tend to focus on paintings that recall, in Lady Butler's words, the pathos and heroism of war. A painting by Butler that brings to mind this latter quality is Scotland Forever, an image so well known that there's almost no need to display it here. Perhaps less well known are those paintings of hers that display the pathos of war. Works such as Calling the Roll after an engagement, Crimea, or Remnants of an Army portraying William Bryden arriving at the gates of Jalalabad. In these paintings, Butler emphasizes the debilitating effects of conflict on rank and file soldiers. Not, I should emphasize, out of a desire to undermine public support for Britain's overseas campaigns, but rather to instill awareness of the sacrifices made by such men. And the emphasis in Butler's works is predominantly on the sacrifices made by soldiers, with little attention given to the effects of war on civilians. On these far-flung battlefields, war is kept at a distance, to adapt the literary critic Mary Favourite's helpful phrase. There are few, if any, traces of the impact of war on the domestic sphere. Now, this is not always the case when attention turns to other notable images from the period, and in this lecture I'm going to consider a range of paintings and photographs that work hard to destabilize the idea that war was an affair that took place exclusively over there, and that boundaries between military and domestic life could be so easily distinguished. So to pave the way for this discussion, I'd like to begin this lecture with a look at some earlier representations of wartime sacrifice, distinct in kind from Butler's focus on the common soldier. At Tate Britain, there is a large-scale history painting dating from the latter half of the 18th century that tells us much about the formation of attitudes to the suffering of soldiers and civilians in times of war. At the center of the canvas, the regimental flags lean forwards, cresting the gilded statue of George II in the smoke-shrouded marketplace. Below the flags, a group of British soldiers bear the body of their commanding officer, who's just been shot in the heart by a musket ball. Seemingly oblivious to the dangers of the surrounding battle, the men regard their fallen comrade with a look of tender concern. Their commander is dead, yet these men behave with dignity and restraint, knowing that their primary objective is not to mourn, but to win. In this well-known picture, the death of Major Pearson, 6th of January 1781, by John Singleton Copley, a work commemorating the successful defence of the British Channel Island of Jersey against an opportunistic French invasion, the figure of the dead military hero is placed right at the centre of the composition, his inverted body forming the locus of a carefully conceived sequence of interlocking diagonals, from the bisecting planes of the British flag to the crisp white letter X's of the soldiers' shoulder straps, from the cocksure defiance of the sculpted scroll to the counterbalanced posture of its regal bearer, from the forward-thrusting bayonets of the 95th Regiment to the latent charge of the leading officer's sword, and from the steep westward rise of the hill in the upper left corner of the composition to the east-leaning gables of the houses in the centre. The powerful drama of force and counterforce in Copley's picture enlists the viewer in a battle for territorial control, at the heart of which lies the inert yet meaningful body of Pearson and his loyal attendants. As with almost every element in the picture, the tableau in the foreground is informed by an overriding sense of geometrical dynamism. The dead weight of the hero's body, which would drag his figure to the bottom right, is compensated, for instance, by the left-leaning posture of one of the supporting officers. Let's go back there. For an uncanny moment, it looks as though the officer is about to use the force stored in his body to pitch Pearson back into the heart of the struggle. The blood that marks the point at which the hero received his fatal wound drips towards the ground, yet this taint of mortality is balanced in turn by the vitality of the upward-pointing flagpole, the pathetic sight of the dying officer's supine sword. There we go. The supine sword is similarly checked by the vigorous verticality of the blade wielded by the officer standing in front of the black rifleman. Go back to that again. It's as if the entire picture were working to provide a solution to the brute materiality of war, the fact that bodies must suffer so that we, the subjects of the crown, might be free. In moral and political terms, the depiction of the calm and tender attitudes of the attendants is meant to provide the viewer with a lesson in wounding. Like West's well-known painting, The Death of General Wolfe, the message of Copley's The Death of Major Pearson is clear. The suffering of the common serviceman is as nothing compared with the heroic sacrifice of the officer hero. So we too become subject to this process as, similarly transfixed by this compelling image, we learn to surrender our own interests to that greater sensibility centered in the man. Now, there are echoes here of classical pietas, such as those by Bellini and Fouquet. So melancholy, hysteria, has no place in this painting. And yet, as the gaze follows the painting's directional logic, it comes to rest eventually on the distressed and bewildered family grouping on the extreme right-hand side of the composition. So let's dwell for a moment on the boy. whose gaze seems to look straight at the viewer. What's this boy trying to tell us? Whilst on the one hand, it would be reasonable to dismiss this moment of intimacy on the grounds that Copley's attempting to encourage us to locate a point of sympathy with the larger, impersonal forces of history, there is, on the other hand, a sense in which the excessive nature of the child's stare induces within us perhaps feelings of terror or bewilderment. In stark contrast, I think, to the controlled attitudes of the soldiers. So, in this connection, it's worth noting that Copley draws inspiration for this painting from Rubens's harrowing vision of the Massacre of the Innocents. Through personal and artistic allusion, therefore, the image at least registers the possibility that pathos, in the original ancient Greek sense of the word, might overcome a kind of aesthetic distance that would lead us to over-identify with the sufferings of others, and by extension, question the necessity of war. So let's bear this lesson in mind as we turn to a very different depiction of the sufferings of war, and this is Joseph Wright's Dead Soldier, which was first exhibited at the Royal Academy exhibition at Somerset House in 1789, on the cusp of the French Revolution. Now, in a rare departure from traditional military portraiture of this period, the late 18th century, the painting depicts a grieving widow and her newly orphaned child beside the body of an unidentified soldier. Another family here, devastated by war. So the Dead Soldier proved to be extremely popular with the gallery-going public in the 1790s, and for many years was esteemed as Wright's most successful work. So in 1814, when it came up to auction, the catalogue describes it as the artist's acknowledged chef d'oeuvre, uniting great knowledge of grouping, excellent drawing, and correct colouring with a fine feeling of sentiment. Now, the key word here is sentiment. When the fashionable Whig poet William Hayley viewed this picture, he declared it to be the flower of the exhibition. His dying soldier literally made me shed tears. Now, I'd venture to suggest that what Hayley responded to in this painting was its pathos, an effect created by the juxtaposition of the warlike scenes to the right of the painting and the threatened domestic scene at its centre. Now here you can see how Wright emphasises that contrast by comparing the earlier and later versions of the painting. See, in this version on the right, the light from the battlefield is much more pronounced. The colours are more intense. Also, you can just about make out the wheel of a cannon there. So, how should we respond to the arresting gaze of the child? It's possible that Wright may have desired his audience to respond to the orphan's gaze with an attitude of parental concern. This love for children, as the 18th century moral philosopher Francis Hutchinson argues, makes them parts of ourselves. And wherever we find a determination to mutual love, let each individual be looked upon as part of a great whole or system and concern himself in the public good of it. So the argument here from Hutchinson is that by exercising our capacity for mutual love, the child, the orphan, will be returned cared for within the bosom of the nation, protected from further violation. And such a reading might well explain William Hayley's sentimental tears, a man who, despite his opposition to the war in America, could yet regard military painting as an important instrument for the dissemination of patriotic feeling. So, for all its pathos and horror, and there is something grisly, I think, about this painting, this later version, isn't there? For all its pathos and horror, one might argue that the dead soldier provides sentimental compensation for war, with the orphan child functioning as a spur to social unification. The part will be returned to the whole. But again, pausing for a moment, I think there's something excessive about the child's gaze. Because unlike Wright's earlier works, or for that matter, unlike this family grouping from 1760, there's no representation within the picture that will serve as a model for the resurrection of the public good. In the absence of such a model, the viewer outside the frame is forced to look inwards. And what does this viewer find? In the highlighting of the mother's breast, a disturbing eroticism, militating against the transcendence of the sensual. In the attention given to the makeshift shelter, a model perhaps of the temporary or vagrant nature of the domestic sphere. And in the dead soldier's gangrenous hand, clutched by the fingers of the child, an image of the destruction of paternal care. So it's a difficult painting to read, I think, and for whatever reason, Wright felt moved in this version of the painting to go beyond the discourse of sentiment. As we gaze on this painting's stark presentation of a decaying body, both the decaying body of the soldier and, by extension, the decaying body that is the family in wartime. The discourse of sentiment works hard to overcome creeping sensations of pain, terror, and disgust. So, in The Dead Soldier, I would suggest, we can no longer consider the opportunities that war presents for the exercise of private virtue. Instead, we're brought into an uncomfortable encounter with the underlying matter of war, its investment in waste and ruin, and the reciprocal destruction of human beings. Well, let's turn now to a sequence of paintings that work hard to counter Wright's somewhat mordant vision of battle and warfare and its impact on the family. And the first painting here is Noel Patton's Home, The Return from Crimea. Completed in 1859, the painting is located in the home of a returning soldier. Not an officer, but a lowly corporal. Tired and weary, his worn-out shoes signifying the labours he's endured, the soldier is embraced by his wife and mother. And there, just beyond the mother, a baby looks towards the viewer. Let's go back to that. So, as the art historian Joan Hickberger observes, the painting carries a range of meanings. Let's go back to it. No, sorry, this clicker is foxing me. There we go. About the nature of man as warrior, of woman as the homemaker, who merely waits, about the reverence of the strong for the gentle or weak, about the domestic nature of the British soldier, the domestic respectability of the working classes, and much more. So a lot has changed since Wright presented his vision of domestic discord on the battlefield. It's important to remember that in the 18th century, soldiers on enlisting had to swear that they were not married. Once in service, only 6 men in 100 were permitted to marry, and then only by permission of the commanding officer. Of course, officers, for their part, weren't restricted in this way. But by the mid-19th century, our period, the Victorian period, Rising concerns over sexual immorality in the army led to the construction of a new military type, a focus on the common soldier as heroic, patriotic, and most importantly, married. These domesticated working-class warriors appear increasingly in post-Crimea paintings. But while these paintings seek to reassure audiences of the respectability of their subjects, perhaps to allay fears of social unrest following the economic hardships of the post-war period, they didn't always succeed in this aim. So look again at the emotions on display in this painting. Yes, there's relief here, but the threadbare furnishings and worn-out shoes are signs of poverty. Might the soldier be wounded? Might he be unfit for work? Will he receive a pension? Such leading questions can only be held in abeyance for so long. So take, for example, there we go again, wrong way. There we are. Take, for example, this famous painting. It's upstairs. You can see it after my talk. It was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1859. It's Henry Nelson O'Neill's Home Again, 1858. And it shows veterans of the First War of Indian Independence, or the Indian Rebellion, disembarking from a troop ship at Gravesend. Wives and sweethearts greet their partners enthusiastically. Infants are reunited with their fathers, while at the bottom of the gantry, an injured sergeant, accompanied by his bonny-faced wife, is assisted to shore by caring assistants. And here we can see some variants on the painting, which indicate its popular appeal. And let's note those clasped hands, so warm and fleshy and vital, and thus so markedly different from Wright's vision of familial decay. There's some other variants here to show you. You can also see Returning Home upstairs, which was a study for the larger painting. Conceived as a companion piece to this painting on the left here, Eastward Ho, Home Again portrays the working-class soldier and his family as united, prosperous, and respectable. No one in this scene is ragged or poor, and the non-commissioned officer is instantly recognizable as a reliable, intelligent, morally responsible member of his class. Still, O'Neill's picture proved too much for the Athenaeum, a literary journal, critical journal of the time, which observed that Home Again is not true. The sick and wounded soldier is sent home like a piece of live lumber and duly drafted to the depot or the hospital. His return is generally unknown until after his arrival. And the crowding down of relatives and friends to greet him on the landing is too generally a myth. Broken health and penury to be abjured in obscurity are all that remain. In a word, the sentiment of Eastward Ho was heroic and elevating, and that in Home Again is depressing. So as Joan Hittberger notes, the review here is remarkable in attacking a painting on the criterion of truth. The painting is not true because it idealizes an event, but at the same time it's undesirable because it's conjuring up these depressing ideas about what will happen to these soldiers in reality. So a picture that appeared better adjusted to the requirements of mid-century tastes is John Dalbiac Luard's Nearing Home, 1858. And here we can see a distinguished-looking officer, presumably, again, a veteran of the war in India, described by one contemporary viewer as still, languid, and listless, with Indian wounds. He's lying on the deck of a ship, attended by his amiable, sedulous, and ladylike wife, with Dover's white cliffs in close proximity. Luard's painting was well received by critics, no doubt because it provided audiences with assurances of the maintenance of spousal affection during times of war and the likelihood of safe return. Now, this one is probably more familiar to you. This again is upstairs in the Myth and Reality exhibition. So a picture that appeared better adjusted to the requirements of mid-century tastes is, I think, John Dalbiac Luard's Nearing Home, again 1858. And here, a distinguished-looking officer, most likely the artist's brother, actually, of 77th Regiment of Foot, who'd served in India and the Crimea. He's described here by one contemporary... sorry, I'm losing my spot here. So it focuses on it's a welcome arrival, and it focuses on a party of men in the Crimea. And here, camaraderie is established by the sharing of a package, a newly opened crate of preserved foods and tobacco from England. And I think that's meant to be the artist, and the officer standing there is probably his brother from the 77th. So where earlier romantic paintings foregrounded the devastating effects of the commingling of the domestic and military spheres, a welcome arrival presents the front as an extension of the home. The scene in which the officer's hut has become a home from home is conveyed not only by the presence of the food parcel, with its assortment of familiar mid-Victorian fare, but also by the engravings that you can see pasted onto the wooden walls of their hut. They're turning their hut, in many ways, into a kind of extemporary art gallery. Isn't it interesting, that sort of way that these pictures, taken from the Illustrated London News, have been incorporated into the painting? So another art historian, Ulrich Keller, says that here, in these pictures on the wall, the subject matter cherished in the field is domestic rather than military. So if you look closely at the painting, what we see here are depictions of domestic scenes, nature scenes, landscapes, theatre plays, and so on, which might well have helped these Crimean soldiers to manage the horror of their daily pursuit. Another way of thinking about this, if they're turning this battlefield hut into a home from home, has it got something to do with the feminization of the battlefield? The fact that these pictures have been taken from the commercial press also provides us with some insight into the effects of the widespread dissemination of war imagery in the age of mechanical reproduction, where images of war were once the sole preserve of a moneyed elite. You had to go to the gallery to see them. Now, through publications like the London Illustrated News, they've become widely available. So, moving forward, it was, of course, the invention of photography that brought images of war to the purview of the masses, in effect, democratizing the consumption of art on account of its affordability. But while photography made images of war more readily available to the public, their social impact was not necessarily straightforwardly progressive. Take, for example, Roger Fenton's portraits of Crimean officers, with their comforting portrayals of class deference and the maintenance of social etiquette on the battlefield. Most notoriously, the photographer's views of Crimean battlefields, captured in the aftermath of conflict, are strikingly devoid of content. We search in vain in these images for any sense of the deprivations experienced by soldiers fighting in the batteries and trenches. Nor, for that matter, do we gain any insight into the conditions of the sick and the wounded, notwithstanding the fact that the miseries of the field and the hospital tents were, as a result of William Russell's reports in the Times, common knowledge. Thus, while the general public were able to read about suffering, they were not permitted to see suffering. But while photographic images of dead and injured men were banished from public consciousness, one notable viewer, Queen Victoria, took a keen interest in witnessing the condition of those men who, though wounded, were lucky enough to have returned. Following visits to the Chatham Hospital, the Queen commissioned the photographers Robert Howlett and Joseph Cundall to take photographs of a selected number of invalid soldiers, many of them mutilated and with missing limbs. Yet, while Howlett's and Cundall's compositions appear unflinching in their stark and somber representations of wartime suffering, the fact that the focus of these images of wounding belongs to the bodies of ordinary working-class soldiers might give us some pause. Where are the officer heroes? The body of the officer hero that was so markedly foregrounded in those late 18th century paintings that I showed earlier is absent here, and therefore we might assume impervious to the effects of wounding. What the Queen sees instead is the lump and uncouth body of the private soldier, the ordinary soldier, for whom mutilation by grape shot, rifle, bullets, and disease is perceived as a natural consequence of service. Once discharged from hospital, the lower class invalid can take his place as an object of charitable attention, his wounds apprehended as signs of voluntary service for the state. Although these pictures appear, therefore, to present a raw, unmediated account of the sufferings of the common soldier, they serve under the guise of inclusiveness merely to render the physical and psychological trauma of war effectively invisible. So, this is the last image I'm going to show you. Let's just pause for a moment and absorb it. This is a portrait of Sergeant Dawson with his daughter at Chatham, 1855. It's been taken by JE Mayall in the aftermath of the Crimean medal ceremony of 18th of May, 1855. And unlike Howlett and Cundall's work, Mayall's image, which was originally intended for commercial distribution and only later incorporated into the Queen's collection, is straightforwardly sentimental. The sight of the sergeant's amputated limb is, on its own terms, undoubtedly affecting, but it is the sitter's direct, piercing stare, conjoined with the anxious expression of the young child nestling in his lap, that draws us further into the composition. So by now you'll have realized there's a theme running through this, and it's to do with children staring at us from these paintings. So, Ulrich Keller, to go back to him, points out that Mayall, renowned for his portraits of royalty, dukes, generals, and the upper middle classes, has gentrified the sergeant, rendering him acceptable for middle-class viewing. But I don't think I agree with this reading. I think it fails to register the peculiar power of the photograph's unscripted details. Mayall could not have manipulated the veteran's haunted, penetrating gaze, a wounded look, that presents a challenge to voyeuristic complacency. Nor, for that matter, could he have anticipated the precise and various effects of the young girl's distress. As happy reunions go, the significance of the scene represented in this photograph is by no means secure. Again, we can ask questions of it. Might the girl be afraid of her father? She's not seen him for a long time. He's a man bearing the mental and physical scars of combat. He's changed. He's become perhaps a stranger to himself as well as to others. Keller, who makes good use of Roland Barthes' study of photography in his discussion, neglects to register the sense in which this image, to quote from Barthes, depicts the living image of a dead thing, and therefore becomes uncanny. Near the beginning of his powerful and compelling study of the photographic image, Camera Lucida, Barthes informs his readers that he is, quote, a spectator interested in photography only for sentimental reasons. I wanted to explore it not as a question, but as a wound. That word sentiment is cropping up a lot in this talk, and what I'm trying to argue here is that we often dismiss sentiment as something that is not rigorous, distracting, it's casting a veil over our eyes. What I'm trying to suggest here with this, and the right painting perhaps, is that sentiment has a kind of radical force to it. If we start to feel something with a painting, something or a photograph, something that wasn't intended necessarily, but nevertheless we feel, then some work is being done, work that might be used to kind of question warfare. So Barthes sees photography as a kind of wound because it reawakens, brings back to life the dead in a kind of spooky way. If we respond to Mayall's portrait sentimentally, then we do not necessarily diminish its historical specificity. And time, I think, is precisely what's at issue in a picture like this. Because photographs present us with an account of what has been. This man and this girl were here, and an indication of what will have been. This man and this girl are no longer here. So what do we see when we look at Sergeant Dawson and his daughter? Do these long deceased, yet eerily alive figures not compel us to acknowledge the power of the photograph to haunt the present? I think with Mayall's photography, we reach the point where the depiction of domesticity and intimacy in Victorian art becomes truly unsettling. And for me, grief and suffering resonate in this image more so than could be portrayed in any painting from the period. So it's with this bold, and I'm sure quite controversial claim that I'm going to end, and I'll just leave you with some images of books. That's one of mine. That's rubbish. The one in the middle is the Keller book that I've been referring to, and Joan Hickberger's Images of the Army, which is a really excellent resource. So that's where I finish. And I'm happy to field questions.